Do you feel like you no longer belong any WH here? Harari explains WH that's a good sign. There is a feeling that is becoming one of the most common inner experiences of our time, and yet it is almost never spoken about directly, because speaking about it requires admitting something that the culture around us consistently frames as a personal failure. It is the feeling of not quite belonging anywhere, not in a dramatic, acute sense of being rejected or ostracized, not necessarily even in a lonely sense, though loneliness often accompanies it, but in a quieter, more persistent sense of slight displacement. The feeling that you are present in the rooms of your life, but not entirely at home in them. That the conversations happening around you are conversations you can participate in, but not fully inhabit. That the communities, the identities, the ideological homes that seem to provide others with a clear and comfortable sense of who they are and where they stand feel, to you, either too small or too certain or too sealed against the complexity you actually experience the world to contain. That you are somehow, despite all the noise and connection of contemporary life, slightly outside of everything, watching from a distance that you did not choose and cannot quite close. If this is your experience, you are not imagining it. You are not broken. You are not suffering from some deficiency of social capacity or emotional warmth that prevents you from connecting in the ways that other people seem to manage more easily. What you are experiencing is something that Yuval Noah Harari has identified, with a precision that most people who live it find startling in its accuracy, as one of the defining and, yes, deeply counterintuitively, one of the most positive symptoms of a genuinely perceptive mind engaging honestly with the specific conditions of this specific historical moment. The feeling of not belonging everywhere is not a sign that something has gone wrong with you. It is, Harari suggests, a sign that something has gone right, that your perception of the world is accurate enough, and your relationship with your own inner experience honest enough to feel the genuine discomfort of inhabiting a historical moment characterized by the dissolution of the very frameworks of belonging that human beings have relied upon throughout the history of the species. To understand why this is a good sign rather than a pathology, we need to understand what belonging actually is, where it comes from, and what is currently happening to it at a civilizational scale. Belonging, in the deepest sense, is not merely the feeling of being socially accepted or included in a group, though it includes that. It is the experience of inhabiting a shared narrative framework, a story about who we are, what matters, what the world is, and where we fit within it. That feels true, that is endorsed by the community around us, and that provides a coherent context within which individual experience can find meaning and direction. It is, in Harari's terms, the subjective experience of being inside a shared intersubjective order, inside a story that enough people around you believe in that the story feels like reality rather than merely one possible narrative among many. For most of human history, these frameworks of belonging were provided with remarkable stability by the combination of religious tradition, geographic community, occupational identity, and family structure that organized daily life for the vast majority of people. You belonged, simultaneously and without contradiction, to a family, to a village or neighborhood, to a trade or occupation, to a religious community, and to the broader cultural identity that encompassed all of these. These different levels of belonging reinforced each other, pointed in roughly the same direction, and together provided the kind of comprehensive, stable, multi-layered sense of location in the world that human beings require to feel genuinely at home in their existence. You knew who you were because you knew where you stood, and you knew where you stood because the frameworks that defined standing were stable, shared, and rarely seriously questioned by those around you. The person who felt slightly outside of all of this, who could not quite inhabit the received frameworks with the unquestioning confidence of their neighbors, who felt the stories as stories rather than as simple reality, was understood, in most historical contexts, primarily as a problem. A heretic, a deviant. Someone whose inability to belong was a symptom of something wrong with them, whether morally, spiritually, or psychologically, depending on the era and the cultural framework doing the diagnosing. The experience of not belonging was pathologized, punished, or at best tolerated as the unavoidable condition of an exceptional individual whose gifts compensated for their social difficulty. It was not understood as a sign of accurate perception or of genuine wisdom. It was understood as a sign of deficiency. But Harari's historical analysis reveals something important about the relationship between the feeling of not belonging and the larger historical context in which it occurs. The people who have, throughout history, played the most important roles in the transition from one civilizational framework to another, the thinkers, artists, reformers, and visionaries who have helped human civilization find new forms of collective meaning when old ones have become inadequate, have consistently been people who, in their own time and context, experienced themselves as not quite belonging to the frameworks available to them. They could see the frameworks as frameworks, which is precisely what made them unable to simply inhabit them with the unself-conscious ease of those who were fully inside them. And this ability to see the framework as a framework, uncomfortable and sometimes socially costly as it was, turned out to be the specific cognitive capacity that allowed them to imagine alternatives, to envision forms of collective meaning and organization that did not yet exist, but that would eventually become the frameworks within which subsequent generations would feel comfortably at home. Copernicus did not belong comfortably to the medieval cosmological framework that placed Earth at the center of the universe. His discomfort with that framework, his inability to make his observations fit the story he had inherited, was not a social or psychological failure. It was the productive friction between an honest mind and an inadequate framework. And it eventually produced a revolution in how human beings understand their place in the cosmos. Luther did not belong comfortably to the religious framework of the medieval Catholic Church. His specific form of alienation from the inherited story was not mere rebelliousness. It was the signal that something in the framework was no longer adequate to the experience of a serious and honest person trying to inhabit it genuinely. Darwin did not belong to the framework of special creation that organized biological understanding in his era. The discomfort he lived with for years, the reluctance he felt to publish what his observations had convinced him was true, was the inner experience of a person who could see a framework as a framework and who knew that what he had seen could not be unseen. None of these people were understood, in their own time, as exhibiting symptoms of good health or accurate perception. They were understood, to varying degrees, as troublemakers, as threats to the frameworks that organized the communities around them, as people whose not belonging was a problem to be solved rather than a capacity to be cultivated. The historical vindication of their perception came only later, after the frameworks they could not inhabit with comfortable, uncritical confidence had been replaced, partly through their efforts, with frameworks that better corresponded to reality. And the people who had most comfortably inhabited the old frameworks, who had felt most at home in the stories that the outliers could not believe completely, did not have an advantage in navigating the transition. They had a disadvantage. Their comfortable belonging made the recognition of the framework's inadequacy more difficult, and the transition to new frameworks more disorienting, precisely because they had more invested in the ones that were passing. This is the pattern that Harari is pointing toward when he suggests that the feeling of not belonging anywhere in the current moment is a good sign. Not that it is comfortable, it is not. Not that it does not involve genuine loss and genuine loneliness, because it does. But that it is, when accurately understood, an indicator of the kind of honest, clear perception of the current situation that is both rare and necessary. The person who feels entirely at home in any of the available ideological or cultural frameworks of 2026, who inhabits one of the ready-made stories about who we are and what matters with complete uncritical confidence, is not demonstrating superior social capacity or superior emotional health. They are demonstrating a relationship with their chosen framework that is more closed than open, more defended than honest, more invested in the comfort of belonging than in the accuracy of the perception that belonging requires them to maintain. This is a difficult thing to say, because it sounds like an insult directed at people who have found genuine community and genuine belonging, and that is not what is intended. Genuine community, genuine belonging, genuine participation in shared frameworks of meaning are among the most important and most valuable things available to human beings. The goal is not to pathologize belonging or to romanticize alienation. The goal is something more precise. It is to distinguish between two fundamentally different relationships with the frameworks of belonging. The relationship of someone who inhabits a framework, because it genuinely corresponds to their honest experience of the world, who belongs because the story they are part of is actually adequate to the complexity of what they know and feel, and the relationship of someone who inhabits a framework because it provides comfort and community and the relief of not having to construct meaning alone, even though the framework's adequacy to the actual complexity of reality is something they have quietly stopped examining. The person who belongs in the first sense is genuinely fortunate. Their belonging is earned by the correspondence between the framework and their honest experience. The person who belongs in the second sense has purchased their sense of home at the cost of a degree of intellectual and emotional honesty that matters. They have, in effect, managed the discomfort of not quite belonging by agreeing to see the framework as more adequate than their honest experience suggests it is. And this management, while effective in the short term at providing the social and psychological benefits of belonging, has costs that accumulate over time. It gradually reduces the range of thoughts you can think clearly, because certain thoughts are incompatible with the framework, and thinking them threatens the belonging that the framework provides. It gradually narrows the community of people you can engage with honestly, because honest engagement threatens the consensus on which the community's coherence depends. And it gradually erodes the relationship with your own inner experience, as the gap between what you genuinely perceive and what the framework allows you to acknowledge grows wider and must be managed with increasing effort. Harari's insight is that the specific conditions of 2026 are making the second form of belonging increasingly difficult to maintain, not because the human desire for belonging has diminished, it has not, but because the pace of change and the scale of disruption to existing frameworks are producing discontinuities that are increasingly difficult to paper over with the ordinary mechanisms of ideological and communal reinforcement. When the world is changing as rapidly as it currently is, frameworks constructed for a previous version of reality reveal their inadequacy in increasingly undeniable ways. The person who has managed their not belonging by adopting one of the available frameworks with uncritical confidence finds, repeatedly, that the framework generates predictions and prescriptions that do not match the realities being encountered. And each such mismatch requires an additional expenditure of the energy that goes into maintaining the gap between framework and reality, an expenditure that accumulates until either the framework is honestly revised or the strain of maintaining it produces the kind of rigidity and defensiveness that characterizes the most brittle forms of ideological commitment. The person who has never quite belonged, who has maintained their relationship with honest perception at the cost of the comfort of complete insider belonging, does not face this specific problem. Not because their life is easier, it is generally not, but because the thing they have been doing all along, holding their experience of the world with a degree of honesty that the available frameworks cannot fully contain, is precisely the thing that is required to navigate a moment when those frameworks are failing more broadly. Their discomfort has been, in a very literal sense, preparation. There is a specific quality of mind that the feeling of not belonging tends to develop in people who engage with it honestly rather than managing it into either complete alienation or forced identification. It is the quality of being able to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing them prematurely into a single framework. It is the capacity to see both the genuine value and the genuine limitations of positions that present themselves as comprehensive and final. It is the ability to feel the emotional pull of a community or an ideology without entirely surrendering one's independent judgment to it. It is what philosophers sometimes call the capacity for negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty, in the space between frameworks, without an irritable reaching after fact and reason that resolves the uncertainty prematurely just to escape its discomfort. This quality is enormously valuable in conditions of genuine complexity and genuine transition. The person who cannot tolerate the discomfort of not belonging to a clear, defined position tends, under pressure, toward one of two failure modes. Either they adopt a framework too completely, surrendering their independent judgment in exchange for the comfort of certainty and community, and becoming thereby less able to update their understanding when the framework proves inadequate. or they collapse into a purely critical posture, a thoroughgoing cynicism about all frameworks that preserves the independence of judgment but loses the capacity for the genuine commitment and community that makes sustained positive contribution possible. The person who has learned to inhabit the not belonging honestly, who has developed the capacity to be genuinely engaged without being entirely captured, who can commit without surrendering their honest perception, has avoided both failure modes. And this is, in the conditions of the current moment, a form of cognitive and emotional resilience that is both rare and genuinely needed. Harari also points towards something important about the relationship between the feeling of not belonging and the specific form of cognitive freedom it tends to produce. The person who belongs completely to a framework, whose identity is deeply invested in a particular story about who they are and what the world is, has a specific cognitive limitation that is invisible from the inside. The limitation is that they cannot easily think the thoughts that contradict the framework, because thinking those thoughts threatens the identity that the framework provides. This is not a character flaw. It is a structural feature of the relationship between identity and cognitive freedom. When your sense of who you are depends significantly on the truth of a particular story about the world, your capacity to honestly evaluate that story is limited, because honest evaluation might require acknowledging that the story is wrong in ways that would destabilize the identity. The investment in the story being true functions as a cognitive tax on the honesty with which it can be examined. The person who does not belong completely to any framework has a different cognitive situation. Because their identity is not fully invested in any single story being correct, they are not subject to the same cognitive tax on honest evaluation. They can think the thoughts that contradict the available frameworks without experiencing it as an existential threat. They can acknowledge complexity, uncertainty, and the limitations of all available positions without feeling that such acknowledgement undermines their sense of who they are. This is a significant cognitive advantage in conditions where honest evaluation of the available frameworks is exactly what is most needed and most difficult to maintain. None of this is an argument for permanent homelessness, for treating not belonging as an end state to be cultivated indefinitely. Human beings genuinely need community. They need relationships of depth and accountability. They need shared frameworks of meaning within which individual experience can find context and direction. The goal is not to remain permanently outside all frameworks, but to maintain the honesty and independence that allows you to participate in communities and frameworks without being captured by them completely, to contribute to the construction of new forms of collective meaning while maintaining the critical relationship with those forms that prevents them from calcifying into the kind of unchallengeable orthodoxies that eventually require another generation of partial outsiders to see through. Harari's broader analysis of where civilization is currently heading suggests that the need for people with this specific capacity, the capacity to hold honest perception and genuine community simultaneously, to see frameworks as frameworks while still being capable of genuine commitment and contribution, is going to increase rather than decrease in the coming years and decades. The pace of change is such that any framework that achieves the kind of stable collective consensus that makes people feel completely at home in it is likely, very quickly, to become inadequate to the reality it was constructed to describe. The ability to participate in shared meaning-making while maintaining enough honest independence to recognize when revision is needed, and to advocate for revision without destroying the community in which the revision must happen, is going to be one of the most important capacities available. There is also an emotional dimension to the not belonging that deserves honest attention, because the counterintuitive claim that it is a good sign should not be used to bypass the genuine pain that it involves. Not belonging is genuinely hard. The human need for belonging is one of the most powerful psychological needs in our emotional repertoire, rooted in evolutionary history that made social inclusion literally a matter of survival. The chronic experience of slight displacement from all available frameworks, the inability to simply rest in the comfort of a clear and shared identity, the loneliness of being someone who sees the seams in stories that others inhabit as seamless reality, these are genuine sources of suffering that deserve acknowledgement rather than intellectualization. What Harari is not saying is that the suffering is unreal, or that the not belonging should be embraced with straightforward enthusiasm. What he is saying is something more careful and more genuinely compassionate. He is saying that when you understand what the not belonging is and where it comes from, when you can see it accurately as the natural experience of an honest mind engaging with a world whose frameworks are genuinely inadequate to the complexity of what is actually happening, the relationship with that experience can change in ways that are not merely intellectually satisfying, but genuinely sustaining. It changes from the experience of a personal failure, of a deficiency in your capacity for normal human connection, to the experience of a specific form of orientation, uncomfortable but not meaningless, that places you in a particular relationship with the current historical moment. A relationship that involves specific responsibilities and specific possibilities that would not be available to you if you were more comfortably inside one of the available frameworks. The specific responsibility is the one that all partial outsiders in transitional periods have faced. The responsibility to think honestly about what the available frameworks are getting right and what they are getting wrong, and to participate in whatever way your specific life enables you to in the construction of the kinds of new frameworks that the next period of collective life will require. This is not a comfortable responsibility. It does not come with a clear job description or a community that fully validates the specific form the work takes. It is the kind of work that happens partly in conversations that feel risky, because they question things the people around you prefer to leave unquestioned, partly in the maintenance of a genuine inner life that continues to take its own honest perceptions seriously, even when the culture around you rewards a different relationship with truth, and partly in the willingness to remain open to the forms of genuine connection and community that are possible even for people who do not belong completely to any available framework, the connections formed in the specific, valuable space between those who have given up searching for the perfect framework and have found, in that shared not belonging, a form of honest fellowship that is different from, but not less, than the belonging they could not achieve elsewhere. Harari himself has spoken honestly about the degree to which his own experience of not quite fitting the available frameworks, of seeing the stories as stories in ways that prevented easy, uncritical habitation of any of them, has been both a source of intellectual productivity and a source of genuine loneliness and difficulty. He does not present it as unambiguously good. He presents it as a condition that carries both costs and possibilities, and that the key is developing the relationship with it that allows the possibilities to be realized without the costs becoming crushing. That relationship begins with honest acknowledgement that the not belonging is real, that the longing for more complete belonging is also real, and that the choice to maintain honest perception at the cost of the comfort of complete insider identification is a choice that deserves to be made consciously and with full awareness of what it costs and what it offers. If you feel like you no longer belong anywhere, or like you have never quite fully belonged anywhere, the first thing to understand is that you are in a very specific kind of company. Not a majority, but a historically significant minority. The minority of people in every era whose honest engagement with their experience of the world has placed them slightly outside the frameworks most readily available for organizing that experience. It is not comfortable company, but it is not bad company. And in a moment when the frameworks that have organized collective life for previous generations are failing more broadly and visibly than at most previous points in human history, when the need for honest, flexible, multi-perspective engagement with the question of what comes next is more urgent than it has been for many generations, the specific discomfort of not quite belonging is not something to be apologized for or managed into something more socially comfortable. It is something to be understood, engaged with honestly, and carried with the dignity that belongs to any form of genuine perception in a world that is often more comfortable with convenient stories than with honest accounts of what is actually happening. You do not belong completely to any available framework because no available framework is entirely adequate to the complexity of what you honestly perceive. This is a sign, Harari insists, of the kind of mind that is most needed at this specific historical juncture. Not the only kind of mind that is needed, not a superior kind of mind in any simple, flattering sense, but the kind of mind that is capable of the specific work that transitional moments require, the work of seeing through the available frameworks honestly enough to participate in the construction of the frameworks that will eventually replace them. The not belonging is the preparation for that work. the discomfort is the signal that the preparation is real. The world is changing in ways that will require new stories. The people who will help construct those new stories are, characteristically, people who could not quite fit inside the old ones. If you are that person, you already know what it costs. What you may not yet fully know is what it is worth. You belong to the making of what comes next. That is a harder home than most. It is also a more important one. To fully appreciate why not belonging in this specific historical moment carries such particular significance, we need to examine more closely what the available frameworks of belonging actually look like in 2026, why they are failing to provide the kind of comprehensive, stable sense of home that belonging has historically offered, and why the failure is not accidental or correctable through better communication or more inclusive community building, but is a structural feature of the specific moment in civilizational time that we are inhabiting. The frameworks of belonging that are currently available to most people in contemporary societies can be broadly grouped into several categories, and each of them is, in different ways, failing to provide the kind of comprehensive orientation that deep belonging requires. Religious frameworks, which provided the most comprehensive and durable forms of belonging for most of human history across most human cultures, are in a condition of accelerating decline in their capacity to serve as primary frameworks of collective meaning for large and growing portions of the global population, particularly in the most technologically developed societies. This decline is not primarily a consequence of theological failure, of religions having been proven wrong in some simple sense. It is a consequence of the mismatch between the specific kinds of questions that religious frameworks are designed to address and the specific kinds of questions that the current technological moment is generating with most urgency. Religious traditions developed over centuries and millennia to address the perennial questions of human existence. Questions about death, suffering, moral obligation, cosmic meaning, and the right way to live within the constraints of a human nature that was assumed to be fixed and given. They were not designed to address questions about the moral status of artificial intelligence, about the ethics of genetic enhancement, about the nature of identity in a world of brain-computer interfaces, about the meaning of work in an economy of automation, about the kind of belonging that is possible for people whose lives are organized more around digital networks than around geographic communities. When people bring these urgently felt contemporary questions to religious frameworks and find that the frameworks either do not address them or address them only through analogies that feel insufficiently fitted to the actual novelty of the situation, they experience a specific form of disappointment that is not about the traditions themselves, but about the mismatch between what the traditions were built to provide and what the moment requires. Political ideologies, which served as primary frameworks of collective meaning and belonging for many people through the 20th century, are in a state of unusual fragmentation and internal incoherence that makes them difficult to inhabit as comprehensive frameworks. The traditional distinctions between left and right, between progressive and conservative, between liberal and nationalist, continue to organize political behavior in formal electoral senses. But they are failing, with increasing visibility, to provide the kind of coherent, comprehensive story about the world that would allow someone to inhabit one of these ideological homes with complete confidence. Both major political traditions in most contemporary democracies are struggling with profound internal contradictions produced by the pace of change. Contradictions between their historical commitments and the realities of the current moment that their internal frameworks have not yet found adequate ways to resolve. The left finds itself simultaneously committed to human dignity and to forms of technological progress that may ultimately threaten it in ways that its analytical frameworks have not fully worked through. The right finds itself simultaneously committed to tradition and to forms of economic dynamism that dissolve the very traditions it claims to value. Neither tradition has an adequate account of the relationship between human identity and artificial intelligence, between democracy and algorithmic governance, between national belonging and global interdependence. The people who sense these inadequacies most clearly, who cannot inhabit either ideological home without feeling the gaps, are not politically confused in a pejorative sense. They are politically honest in a moment when honesty about the limitations of available frameworks is precisely what is most uncomfortable and most needed. National identity, the sense of belonging to a people with a shared history, shared culture, and shared destiny, remains powerful as an emotional phenomenon in many parts of the world, and its power should not be underestimated or dismissed. But it too is failing, for many people, to provide the kind of comprehensive framework of belonging that it offered in its periods of greatest strength. The globalizing forces of the past several decades have produced a world in which the daily experience of most people in developed economies is shaped as much by global networks of culture, commerce, and communication as by national ones, making the national story feel, to many people, like one important layer of identity among several rather than the primary framework within which all others are organized. Migration has created enormous populations whose relationship with national identity is more complex and more plural than the simple model of belonging to a nation assumes. The increasing visibility of the selective and constructed nature of national narratives, the way that shared national history always involved the exclusion of certain stories and the amplification of others, has made uncritical inhabitation of national identity more difficult for people who are aware of those constructions. And the genuine global challenges of the current moment, climate change, AI governance, pandemic preparedness, nuclear risk, challenges that do not respect national borders and that cannot be adequately addressed within national frameworks, keep bumping against the limits of national belonging in ways that people paying attention cannot easily ignore. Cultural identity, belonging to a subculture, an aesthetic community, a professional tribe, a lifestyle enclave, has increasingly filled the void left by the declining comprehensive power of religious, political, and national frameworks of belonging. And these smaller, more specific forms of identity can provide genuine community, genuine aesthetic pleasure, and genuine shared language that is real and valuable. But they share a common limitation that prevents them from serving as comprehensive frameworks of belonging in the way that the larger frameworks once did. They are organized around partial identities, around specific aspects of the self, rather than around the whole person in the whole of their existence. You can belong genuinely to a professional community, to a music subculture, to an aesthetic movement, to a hobby community, and still experience the persistent feeling that no available framework provides a home for the whole of what you are, for the full complexity of your values, your perceptions, your uncertainties, and your specific way of being in the world. The partial belongings are real, but they do not aggregate into the comprehensive belonging that human beings require at the deepest level of their psychological architecture. This is the specific landscape of belonging in 2026 that Harari is pointing toward when he suggests that the feeling of not belonging anywhere is a good sign.